My name is Claire, and at my father's retirement celebration after 32 years at Pacific Engineering Solutions, he stood in front of 200 colleagues and called me the biggest mistake of his career. But what he didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting every email, every financial transfer, and every illegal favor he'd been doing for his cronies. By the time the evening ended, his golden parachute had turned into a lead balloon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering that screamed expensive. David Hartwell's retirement celebration, it announced in flowing script, followed by honoring 3 decades of engineering excellence at Pacific Engineering Solutions. At the bottom, in smaller print, it listed the guest of honor's family, Linda, Ryan, and guest. Not Claire. Just guest. I should have thrown it away right then. Should have saved myself the humiliation of watching my father's colleagues pretend they didn't know who I was, while my brother Ryan got introduced as the next generation of Hartwell engineering talent. But something deep in my chest, some stubborn part of me that still believed family meant something, made me RSVP yes. The Riverside Country Club sat perched on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River, its Tudor-style architecture and manicured grounds screaming old money and older traditions. I had been here exactly 3 times in my life. Ryan's high school graduation party, his college graduation party, and his wedding reception. Each time, I'd felt like a trespasser in designer clothing borrowed from friends, because my nonprofit salary couldn't stretch to country club appropriate attire. This time was no different. I wore a navy blue dress I'd found on sale at Nordstrom Rack, simple and understated, hoping to blend into the background. The valet took my 10-year-old Honda Civic with the same professional smile he probably reserved for all the economy cars that occasionally wandered into his luxury kingdom, though I noticed him park it in the back corner, where it wouldn't offend the BMWs and Mercedes lining the main drive. The ballroom buzzed with the particular energy of corporate celebrations. Men in perfectly tailored suits clustered around cocktail tables, their conversations punctuated by the kind of hearty laughter that comes easy when everyone's bonuses depend on staying in good graces. Their wives, impeccably dressed and professionally pleasant, discussed charity galas and private school admissions with the casual authority of people who'd never worried about money. I spotted my family immediately. Dad stood at the center of a group near the bar, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit expensive enough to feed a family for months. At 65, David Hartwell still commanded attention the way he had when I was little, when I thought he was the most important man in the world. Mom floated nearby in a champagne-colored cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her smile bright and practiced as she accepted congratulations from well-wishers. Ryan held court at a nearby table, his engineering degree from Stanford, and his position as Pacific Engineering's youngest senior project manager, making him the natural heir to Dad's legacy. At 32, he looked like a younger version of our father, all confidence and inherited privilege. His wife Jessica stood beside him, her designer maternity dress showcasing what would be the next generation of Hartwell engineers. I approached slowly, weaving through clusters of conversations about municipal contracts and residential developments. A few faces turned toward me with polite confusion, the kind of look people get when they recognize someone but can't quite place them. I'd worked part-time at Pacific during college summers, filing documents and running errands, but that was a decade ago, and apparently forgettable. Claire, Mom's voice carried just enough surprise to make nearby conversations pause. You made it. The way she said it suggested my attendance was both unexpected and potentially problematic. She air-kissed my cheek, her perfume expensive and overwhelming, while her eyes quickly scanned my outfit for any signs of embarrassment. Of course I made it, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It's Dad's retirement party. Well, yes, but we know how busy you are with your... She paused, searching for the right words. Your charity work. Dad turned at the sound of my voice, his expression shifting from jovial host to something cooler, more guarded. Claire, didn't expect to see you here. The invitation said family was welcome, I said, producing the cream cardstock from my purse. Though I noticed it didn't actually mention my name. An uncomfortable silence settled over our small group. Ryan stepped in with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years mediating family tensions. "Hey, sis," he said, giving me a quick hug that felt more obligatory than affectionate. "How's the nonprofit world treating you?" "Can't complain," I answered, but we all knew that wasn't true. I'd been working at Portland Youth Services for 5 years, helping kids aging out of foster care find housing and job training. The work was meaningful, but the pay was terrible, something my family never let me forget. Still saving the world one troubled teen at a time? Dad's voice carried a familiar edge of dismissal. "When are you going to get a real job?" The question hit like a slap, but I'd learned long ago not to react. Helping kids find stable housing and job training seems pretty real to me. "You know what I mean," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "Something with actual career prospects, growth potential. Ryan's already being considered for partner track." "Dad," Ryan said quietly, "maybe this isn't the time." "When is the time?" Dad interrupted. "She's 30 years old, living in some cramped apartment in Hawthorne, driving a car that's older than some of the interns at the office. When do we stop pretending this is just a phase?" The conversations around us had definitely stopped now. I could feel eyes turning in our direction, the subtle shift in attention that happens when family drama threatens to spill into public spaces. Mom's hand found Dad's arm, a gentle warning to lower his voice. "David," she murmured, "people are watching." "Let them watch," he said. But he did lower his voice slightly. "Maybe it's time Claire heard some hard truths about what happens when you waste your potential." I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to walk away, to preserve what little dignity I had left, and escape before this got worse. But something kept my feet planted. Maybe it was the way the woman at the next table was trying not to stare, or the fact that Ryan's colleagues were starting to whisper among themselves. Maybe it was 30 years of being the family disappointment finally demanding its moment of reckoning. "Waste my potential?" I repeated, my voice carefully controlled. "Is that what you call helping kids who have nowhere else to go?" "I call it an expensive college degree being used to enable other people's bad decisions," Dad replied. "You could have been anything, Claire. Engineer, architect, business owner. Instead, you chose to work for peanuts, helping people who can't help themselves." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Around us, the party continued its careful pretense of normalcy, but I could feel the weight of attention, the way conversations had quieted just enough to catch our family drama without appearing to eavesdrop. "Some of those people are kids, Dad," I said, my voice starting to shake despite my efforts to stay calm. "Kids who never had parents to pay for college or country club memberships or connections to get them jobs." "And that's very noble," Mom interjected, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But surely you can see David's point. You're not getting any younger, and this job of yours, well, it's not exactly building toward anything, is it? It's building toward making a difference." I shot back, the careful control finally starting to crack. "Not everything has to be about money and status and, oh, spare us the righteousness," Dad cut me off. "You want to know what your job is really building toward? Resentment. Yours and ours. You think we don't know how you look at us? Like we're some kind of villains for wanting our daughter to succeed?" "I do succeed," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Just not in ways you can brag about at your country club." Dad's face darkened. "Don't you dare lecture me about success, young lady. Do you know what success looks like? It looks like 32 years of building something that matters. It looks like raising a son who's going to carry on that legacy. It looks like having something to show for your life besides good intentions and other people's problems." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed for maximum impact. I could see Jessica's face, embarrassed and uncomfortable. I could see Ryan struggling between loyalty to me and deference to Dad. I could see Mom's tight smile, the one she wore when she was mortified but trying to maintain appearances. And I could see Dad's colleagues, some trying to pretend they weren't listening, others openly staring at the family meltdown happening in front of the shrimp cocktail station. You want to know what I think success looks like? Dad continued, his voice carrying enough to reach nearby tables. It looks like my son Ryan, who's going to make partner before he's 35. It looks like Jessica, who graduated summa cum laude from Portland State and chose to build a family instead of chasing pipe dreams. It doesn't look like a 30-year-old woman playing house with society's rejects because she's too stubborn to admit she chose wrong. The ballroom seemed to tilt slightly, the crystal chandeliers and expensive florals blurring at the edges of my vision. This wasn't just disappointment or frustration anymore. This was deliberate cruelty, performed for an audience that would remember this moment long after Dad's retirement speech was forgotten. "David," Mom hissed, her composure finally cracking. "That's enough." But he wasn't finished. "You know what the real tragedy is? We gave you every opportunity. Private school, college tuition, connections that could have opened any door you wanted. And you threw it all away to play savior to people who don't even appreciate it. Sometimes, I think."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He paused, as if considering whether to cross the final line. In that moment of silence, I could hear the soft clink of silverware against plates, the murmur of conversations resuming at nearby tables, the distant sound of jazz music from the bar area. Normal sounds of a normal party, backdrop to the destruction of what was left of my relationship with my father. "Sometimes you think what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad looked at me with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. "Sometimes I think the biggest mistake I ever made was not pushing harder when you were younger. Not forcing you to see reality before you got so invested in this fantasy that helping people would somehow make up for everything else you're not." The words landed like a physical blow, driving the breath from my lungs. Not my career choices, not my lifestyle, me. I was the mistake. The silence that followed felt eternal. I stood there in my discount dress, surrounded by my father's success and my family's disappointment, while 200 witnesses absorbed the fact that David Hartwell considered his younger daughter a fundamental error in judgment. Ryan stepped forward, his face pale. "Dad, you can't what?" Dad snapped. "Can't tell the truth? Can't say what everyone in this room is thinking? Look around, Ryan. Look at your sister, and then look at your wife. Look at your life, and then look at hers. Which one of you is going to give me grandchildren I can be proud of? Which one of you is building something that will last?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's hand moved protectively to her barely visible bump, and I realized that even this moment, this public humiliation, was really about showcasing her success against my failure. The grandchild on the way, the engineering legacy, the family name being carried forward by the right child. I looked around the ballroom, at the faces trying not to stare, at the colleagues who would go home tonight with stories about David Hartwell's embarrassing daughter. I saw my reflection in the mirror behind the bar, small and out of place in a room full of people who belonged. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to belong with them. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice carrying despite its softness. "I am different from Ryan, different from Jessica, different from you." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he'd expected tears or apologies, not agreement. "I chose a career helping people instead of exploiting them," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I chose to measure success by lives changed instead of dollars earned. I chose to build something meaningful instead of just profitable. And if that makes me a mistake in your eyes, then I'll wear that label proudly." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small wrapped gift, something I'd brought despite knowing it probably wouldn't be welcome. "This is for you, Dad. A thank you for 32 years of teaching me exactly who I don't want to become." I placed the package on the nearest table without waiting for a response. Inside was a simple picture frame with a photo from my work. A group of teenagers who'd graduated from our housing program, all of them grinning at the camera in their caps and gowns. Kids who'd aged out of foster care and found stable homes and jobs with our help. Kids whose success couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or country club memberships, but who were building lives worth living. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. Behind me, I could hear Mom's voice, strained and apologetic, trying to smooth over the scene for their guests. I could hear Ryan saying something to Jessica, probably an explanation or an apology for his crazy sister. I could hear Dad's voice, louder than the others, probably already moving on to safer topics like municipal contracts and retirement plans. But I wasn't listening anymore. For the first time in 30 years, I was walking away from their expectations, their disappointment, their need to reshape me into someone I'd never wanted to be. I collected my Honda from the embarrassed valet and drove home through the Portland streets, past the boutiques and coffee shops of Hawthorne, past the apartments and small businesses that made up my world. It wasn't glamorous or impressive, but it was mine. Back in my small apartment, surrounded by photos of kids I'd helped, and thank you cards from families who'd found stability through our programs, I sat down at my kitchen table and did something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to the details of my father's career that I'd always ignored. The contracts, the connections, the way certain projects always seemed to go to certain companies, the retirement package that seemed unusually generous even for someone with Dad's seniority. Because if David Hartwell wanted to call me a mistake, then maybe it was time for this mistake to start asking some questions about how exactly he'd built his perfect successful life. And maybe it was time to find out whether his retirement celebration was premature. The next morning came too early, filtered through the thin curtains of my studio apartment like an unwelcome reminder that the world kept spinning despite personal catastrophes. I'd barely slept, replaying Dad's words over and over until they'd worn grooves in my brain. The biggest mistake I ever made. The phrase echoed with each sip of bitter coffee, each glance at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, each moment of consciousness that reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still the family disappointment. I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe 3 times in 5 years. My supervisor, Maria, understood without needing details. She'd met my family once at a charity fundraiser, had seen the way they looked at her like she was part of my unfortunate life choices rather than a dedicated social worker, with 2 master's degrees and 15 years of experience helping kids find their footing in an unforgiving world. Instead of heading to the office, I found myself sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by banker's boxes I hadn't opened in years. These were the remnants of my childhood, the things Mom had packed up when they converted my bedroom into Dad's home office. Photo albums, school papers, old birthday cards, the detritus of a life lived in the shadow of someone else's expectations. The first box yielded mostly innocuous memories. Elementary school art projects, featuring stick figure families, where I'd always drawn myself slightly apart from the others, even then sensing I didn't quite fit. Middle school photos where I stood awkwardly beside Ryan, who even at 13 had possessed the easy confidence that would carry him through Stanford and into Dad's professional circle. High school newspaper clippings about Ryan's academic achievements, his admission to engineering programs, his summer internships at Pacific Engineering. I was looking for my own achievements, my own moments of recognition, but they were conspicuously absent. Not because I hadn't accomplished things, but because those accomplishments apparently hadn't been worth preserving. My acceptance letter to Portland State's social work program was nowhere to be found, but Ryan's Stanford admission was carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. My graduation photo was missing, but there were multiple copies of Ryan's engineering degree ceremony. The second box was more revealing. Here were the family Christmas cards from the past decade, and looking at them chronologically was like watching myself disappear in slow motion. The early ones featured all 4 of us arranged around the fireplace, Dad's hand on Ryan's shoulder, Mom's arm around my waist. But as the years progressed, the compositions changed. By the time Ryan graduated college, the photos showed 3 people plus an awkward 4th figure standing slightly apart. In the most recent cards, I appeared only as a name on the inside signature, no longer worth including in the visual representation of the Hartwell family's success story. I found a folder labeled Family Financial Planning that must have been accidentally included in my belongings. Inside were documents I wasn't supposed to see, photocopies of wills and trust fund paperwork, investment statements, and insurance policies. My hands shook as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just family record-keeping. This was evidence of how thoroughly I'd been written out of their future. The trust fund Dad had established for his children wasn't split equally. Ryan was designated to receive 75% upon Dad's retirement, with 20% going to, quote, future grandchildren, and 5% allocated to, quote, charitable contributions in the family name. My name appeared nowhere in the documentation. Literally nowhere. As if I'd never existed. The will was even more brutal in its precision. The family home would go to Ryan and Jessica. Dad's investment portfolio would be divided between Ryan and any grandchildren. Mom's jewelry and personal effects would pass to daughters-in-law and granddaughters. The vacation cabin at Mount Hood, the place where I'd spent every childhood summer learning to fish and hike and identify bird calls, was designated for Ryan's family as a, quote, generational retreat for future Hartwell engineers. I stared at these documents for a long time, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. This wasn't the impulsive cruelty of a retirement party speech. This was calculated, methodical erasure. Legal documents drawn up by attorneys, signed and notarized and filed away, ensuring that even after death, David Hartwell's disappointment in his younger daughter would continue to shape her reality. But what caught my attention wasn't just the exclusion. It was the numbers. Dad's portfolio was worth significantly more than I'd ever imagined, even accounting for his senior position at Pacific Engineering. The investment statements showed consistent deposits far exceeding his documented salary, deposits that had been flowing into private accounts for years. I grabbed my laptop and started cross-referencing the dates of these deposits with public records I could access online. Portland's municipal construction projects were matters of public record, their budgets and timelines and contractor selections all documented in city databases that any citizen could review. What I found made my stomach drop. Every major deposit into Dad's private accounts corresponded with a Pacific Engineering contract award. Not his salary or bonuses, but direct payments that seemed to follow a pattern I was beginning to recognize. The convention center renovation, the waterfront development project, the school district facilities upgrade. All of them Pacific Engineering contracts. All of them followed within weeks by mysterious deposits into accounts that weren't listed on any tax documents I could find. I spent the rest of the morning creating a timeline, matching deposit dates with project announcements, cross-referencing contractor lists with what I could find about Pacific Engineering's bidding practices. The pattern that emerged was clear enough to make my hands shake. Dad wasn't just a successful engineer. He was taking kickbacks. The realization hit like ice water. My father, who'd spent 30 years lecturing me about integrity and work ethic and earning your place in the world, had been systematically taking bribes from subcontractors in exchange for favorable project selections. The retirement package that had seemed unusually generous was funded by years of corruption, and nobody at Pacific Engineering seemed to know about it. Or maybe they did know. Maybe that's why the retirement party had felt so performative, so focused on Dad's legacy and contributions, without getting too specific about what those contributions actually entailed. Maybe the whole celebration was cover for pushing him out before anyone started asking uncomfortable questions about project budgets and contractor selection processes. I called my Uncle Marcus, Dad's younger brother, who had always been the family outsider by virtue of choosing teaching over business. Marcus taught high school math in Salem and had never quite fit into Dad's corporate world, which had always made him my favorite relative. If anyone would give me an honest perspective on family dynamics, it would be him. "Claire, honey," his voice was warm but surprised. "How are you holding up after last night?" So he'd heard. Of course he'd heard. The Hartwell family communication network was efficient when it came to spreading news about my latest failures. "You were there?" I asked, though I knew he hadn't been. Uncle Marcus wasn't part of Dad's professional circle. "Linda called this morning," he said gently. "She wanted to make sure I understood that things got a little heated. That maybe you misunderstood your father's intentions." I laughed, short and bitter. Misunderstood? He called me the biggest mistake of his career in front of 200 people. What exactly was I supposed to understand? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Your father has always had strong opinions about what success looks like. That doesn't make him right. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to something that felt dangerous. How much do you know about Dad's work? The contracts, the projects, the way Pacific Engineering always seems to get the best municipal deals? Another pause, longer this time. Why are you asking? Because I found some financial documents, and the numbers don't add up. Dad's been depositing money that doesn't match his salary, and it always happens right after Pacific gets a new city contract. Claire. Marcus's voice carried a warning. You need to be very careful about accusations like that. I'm not making accusations, I said. I'm asking questions. Questions about why my father can afford to retire at 65 with a portfolio worth more than most people see in a lifetime, while working for a mid-sized engineering firm in Portland. Marcus sighed deeply. Your father has always been good with investments. These aren't investment returns, Marcus. These are direct deposits, always in round numbers, always from accounts I can't trace. This looks like payment for services that aren't listed on any company documentation. Even if that were true, Marcus said carefully, what would you plan to do about it? The question hung in the air between us. What was I planning to do? 24 hours ago, I'd been trying to survive a family dinner where my biggest concern was whether Dad would criticize my career choices. Now I was sitting on evidence that might implicate him in municipal corruption, while still processing the fact that he'd legally erased me from his life. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I can't just pretend I didn't see this. Claire, listen to me. Marcus's voice grew urgent. Your father is a powerful man with powerful friends. If you start making noise about his business practices, you need to be absolutely certain about what you're alleging, and absolutely prepared for the consequences. What consequences could be worse than being disowned at a retirement party? Prison, Marcus said bluntly. If David has been taking kickbacks and you can prove it, we're not talking about family embarrassment. We're talking about federal charges. Wire fraud, conspiracy, bribery. The kind of charges that destroy entire families, not just the person who committed the crimes. I stared at the documents spread across my coffee table, seeing them with new clarity. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings or family dynamics anymore. This was about criminal activity that had been funding Dad's lifestyle for years, possibly decades. Money that should have gone to public works projects had instead been diverted into private accounts, inflating construction budgets, and ultimately costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Marcus, I said slowly, what if prison is exactly where he belongs? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about my uncle's fears and loyalties. He loved his brother, despite everything. He'd probably suspected something wasn't quite right about Dad's financial situation, but had chosen not to look too closely. Now I was forcing him to confront the possibility that his successful older brother was a criminal. I have to go, Marcus said finally. But Claire, please. Think about what you're considering. Think about your mother, about Ryan and Jessica and the baby. Think about whether exposing this will actually accomplish anything positive or just destroy everyone you've ever cared about. After he hung up, I sat in my apartment surrounded by evidence of my father's crimes and my family's systematic exclusion of me from their lives. The smart thing would be to put everything back in the boxes, pretend I'd never seen any of it, and go back to my job helping foster kids while my family continued their successful charade. But smart wasn't what I felt. What I felt was 30 years of accumulated rage finally finding a target worthy of its intensity. Dad had called me a mistake, had erased me from his will and his trust fund and his family photos, had convinced himself and everyone else that I was a failure who would never amount to anything. Maybe it was time to show him exactly what this mistake was capable of accomplishing. I spent the afternoon researching Portland's municipal contracting procedures, learning about bidding processes and oversight committees, and the penalties for corruption in public works projects. I found contact information for the city auditor's office, for investigative journalists at the Oregonian, for federal prosecutors who specialized in construction fraud. I wasn't ready to make those calls yet, but I was getting ready. That evening, I drove to the Mount Hood cabin for the first time in 3 years. Dad had made it clear that my visits weren't particularly welcome there, that the place was being reserved for family activities that apparently didn't include me. But I still had a key, and according to the will I'd found, I had about as much legal right to be there as I was ever going to get. The cabin sat nestled among Douglas firs and western red cedars, its log walls weathered to a soft gray that blended perfectly with the Pacific Northwest landscape. This had been my sanctuary as a child, the place where Dad had taught me to tie fishing knots and identify constellations, where Mom had let me help her cook elaborate camping meals on the wood-burning stove. Before Ryan's achievements had overshadowed everything else, before my career choices had marked me as the family disappointment, this place had belonged to all of us equally. I walked through rooms that still smelled like wood smoke and pine needles, touching furniture that held memories of better times. The guest room that had been mine during family vacations was now clearly established as Ryan and Jessica's space, decorated with their wedding photos and filled with expensive outdoor gear I'd never seen before. The living room mantel displayed Ryan's engineering awards and Jessica's sorority composite, but no trace of my college graduation or social work certification, or any of the commendations I'd received for my work with foster youth. Even here, in what had once been neutral family territory, I'd been carefully edited out of the narrative. But the cabin also held something else. Dad's home office away from home, the place where he kept files that were too sensitive for his downtown workspace. The desk was locked, but I'd learned to pick simple locks during my college years, working with kids who'd aged out of foster care, many of whom had developed creative survival skills on the streets. Inside the desk drawers, I found what I'd been looking for without quite knowing it. Copies of contracts, correspondence with subcontractors, detailed project budgets that showed discrepancies between what the city had authorized and what Pacific Engineering had actually spent. Names and phone numbers of contractors who'd paid consulting fees for project information that should have been confidential. Email printouts discussing, quote, mutually beneficial arrangements and, quote, consideration for future opportunities. It was all there. Years of documentation that Dad had kept as either insurance or trophies. Proof of every bribe and kickback and fraudulent invoice that had funded his comfortable retirement, and Ryan's privileged upbringing, and the family lifestyle I'd never quite been worthy of joining. I photographed everything with my phone, uploading the images to a secure cloud storage account as I worked. By the time I finished, I had documentation spanning nearly a decade of systematic municipal corruption, all of it bearing my father's signature and contact information. The drive back to Portland felt different than the drive up had. The mountain roads that had seemed familiar and comforting a few hours earlier now felt like the path between my old life and whatever came next. Behind me was the cabin where I'd learned that even my childhood memories had been retroactively claimed by Ryan's family. Ahead was a city where my father's corruption had been systematically stealing from taxpayers for years. And in between was me, with a phone full of evidence and a decision to make about whether David Hartwell's biggest mistake was about to become his biggest problem. Back in my apartment, I laid out everything I'd found and everything I'd photographed, creating a comprehensive timeline of Dad's criminal activity. The pattern was clear, the documentation was solid, and the implications were staggering. Pacific Engineering had been awarded nearly $50 million in municipal contracts over the past decade, and Dad had personally profited from every single one of them. This wasn't just garden-variety corruption. This was systematic theft from public funds, orchestrated by a man who'd built his reputation on integrity and public service, while privately enriching himself at taxpayers' expense. I thought about Marcus's warning, about the consequences for the whole family if this came to light. I thought about Mom's social standing, about Ryan's career prospects, about Jessica and the baby who would grow up with the Hartwell name attached to criminal convictions. And then I thought about Dad's words at the retirement party, about being called a mistake in front of 200 witnesses, about 30 years of being treated like a failed experiment in parenting. Some mistakes, I realized, were worth making twice. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that made Portland feel like it was wrapped in wet wool. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching my neighbors emerge from their apartments to begin another ordinary day. They had no idea that the woman in 3B was sitting on evidence that could topple one of the city's most respected engineering firms and send a pillar of the community to federal prison. The weight of what I discovered sat in my chest like a stone. All weekend, I'd been going through the documents again and again, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building what any prosecutor would recognize as an airtight case against David Hartwell. But having the evidence and knowing what to do with it were two very different things. I called in sick to work again, something that would normally fill me with guilt. Maria had built our department's reputation on reliability and dedication, and my kids depended on consistent support as they navigated the transition from foster care to independent living. But today, those responsibilities felt distant compared to the decision that was reshaping everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Instead of heading to Portland Youth Services, I drove downtown to the Central Library. If I was going to move forward with this, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The legal databases available through the library's computers would give me access to case law and precedent that I couldn't afford through private research services. The law library was nearly empty at 9 a.m. Just a few early researchers scattered among the stacks and a librarian who looked like she'd been there since the building opened. I settled into a corral near the back, surrounded by volumes of Oregon state statutes and federal criminal codes, and began the process of educating myself about municipal corruption cases. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The federal government took construction fraud seriously, especially when it involved public works projects. The penalties were severe: conspiracy charges that could result in decades in prison, forfeiture of assets obtained through criminal activity, and civil liability that could bankrupt not just the individual, but potentially their family members who'd benefited from the illegal proceeds. But the cases I read also showed how difficult these prosecutions could be. Federal prosecutors needed to prove not just that money had changed hands, but that there was explicit quid pro quo arrangements, that the payments were made with corrupt intent, and that the defendants had willfully violated federal law. Defense attorneys were skilled at portraying their clients as naive businessmen who'd made poor judgment calls rather than criminal masterminds. I spent hours reading through successful prosecutions, looking for patterns in how cases were built and presented. The strongest cases combined financial evidence with communications that showed clear intent to violate the law. Email chains discussing arrangements and considerations were particularly damaging, especially when they could be tied to specific contract awards and subsequent payments. Dad's files contained exactly this kind of evidence, not just the financial records showing payments that corresponded with contract awards, but detailed correspondence that left little doubt about the quid pro quo nature of the relationships. In one particularly damaging email chain, Dad had explicitly told a subcontractor that Pacific Engineering's support for their bid would depend on, quote, continued collaboration on ancillary consulting opportunities that would benefit both parties. By noon, I had compiled a comprehensive overview of what a federal prosecutor would need to build a case against Dad. The evidence I'd found would easily meet the burden of proof for conspiracy and wire fraud charges. With the documentation spanning nearly a decade, the pattern was too clear to dismiss as coincidence or poor judgment. But I also understood the collateral damage that would follow. Ryan's position at Pacific Engineering would become untenable once the investigation became public. Mom's social standing in Portland's charitable community would evaporate overnight. Jessica and the baby would inherit a family name associated with criminal corruption rather than engineering excellence. The question wasn't whether I could destroy Dad's life. The question was whether I should. I left the library and drove aimlessly through Portland's neighborhoods, trying to process what felt like an impossible decision. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that this was about justice, about preventing further corruption, about holding powerful people accountable for their crimes. But another part recognized the truth I didn't want to acknowledge. This was also about revenge. Dad had humiliated me publicly, had systematically erased me from family documentation, had called me the biggest mistake of his career. Part of what drove me toward exposing his crimes was the desire to see him suffer the way he'd made me suffer, to watch his carefully constructed reputation crumble the way mine had at the retirement party. Was that justice or just vindictiveness? Did it matter if the end result was the same? I found myself parked outside Portland Youth Services, staring at the modest building where I'd spent 5 years trying to make a difference in kids' lives. Through the windows, I could see Maria at her desk, probably dealing with the crisis management that defined our daily work. Teenagers aging out of foster care didn't pause their problems because their caseworker was having a family crisis. My phone buzzed with a text from Keisha, one of our success stories from 3 years ago. She'd been 17 when she'd aged out of the system, pregnant and homeless, and convinced that her life was already over before it had really begun. Now she was finishing her associate's degree in early childhood education while raising her daughter in stable housing we'd helped her secure. The text was simple: thinking about you today, hope everything's okay. Somehow, word about the retirement party had reached even my kids. The Portland nonprofit community was small and interconnected, and bad news traveled fast among people who'd learned to watch for signs that the adults in their lives might disappear or let them down. I thought about Keisha's journey from homeless teenager to stable young mother, about the dozen other kids who'd found their footing with our program's support, about the teenagers currently in our system who were counting on consistent advocacy as they navigated the impossible transition to independent adulthood. Then I thought about the millions of dollars Dad had stolen from public funds over the years, money that could have funded youth programs and housing initiatives and educational support systems. His corruption hadn't just enriched his family at taxpayers' expense. It had directly reduced the resources available for exactly the kind of work I'd dedicated my career to supporting. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. This wasn't about revenge or family dynamics or hurt feelings. This was about the kids who'd been denied services because public money had been diverted into David Hartwell's private accounts. This was about justice for people who couldn't advocate for themselves because they'd never had the privilege and connections that came with growing up in families like mine. I walked into Portland Youth Services and found Maria in her office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups, and the controlled chaos that defined nonprofit management. She looked up when I appeared in her doorway, her expression shifting from relief to concern as she registered whatever she saw in my face. "Claire," she said, setting down her pen, "are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I need to ask you a hypothetical question," I said, closing her office door behind me. "If you discovered that someone in a position of authority had been stealing money that should have gone to programs like ours, what would you do?" Maria leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the careful attention she reserved for crisis situations. "How hypothetical are we talking?" "Let's say completely hypothetical," I replied. "But let's also say the evidence was overwhelming and the theft was significant." "Is this about your father's retirement party?" she asked gently. I should have known Maria would have heard something. Portland's nonprofit and municipal sectors overlapped in complex ways, and Maria had been working in social services long enough to know most of the major players in city government and business. "What did you hear?" I asked. "That there was some kind of family confrontation," she said carefully. "That your father made some unfortunate comments about your career choices." I laughed, short and bitter. "That's one way to put it." Maria waited, using the silence that was one of her most effective counseling tools. She'd learned that people usually filled uncomfortable pauses with more truth than they'd intended to share. "He called me the biggest mistake of his career," I said finally. "In front of 200 people, including his colleagues and clients and half of Portland's business community." "I'm sorry," Maria said, and her tone made it clear she understood the full implications of public humiliation in a city like Portland, where professional relationships were often personal and reputations were carefully cultivated over decades. "But that's not the hypothetical question," I continued. "The hypothetical question is about finding evidence that someone has been systematically stealing from municipal construction budgets for years." Maria's expression shifted. "Claire, are you talking about your father?" "I'm talking about a hypothetical situation," I insisted, though we both knew the pretense was thin. "Okay," she said slowly. "In a hypothetical situation like that, I would want to make sure the evidence was solid and the allegations were serious enough to warrant the personal cost of making them public. And if they were? Then I would have an obligation to report what I'd found," Maria said without hesitation. "Not because of personal feelings or family dynamics, but because public funds that get diverted from their intended purposes directly harm the people we serve. Every dollar that gets stolen from municipal budgets is a dollar that doesn't go to housing programs or youth services or mental health support." She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I would also want to be absolutely certain about what I was alleging and absolutely prepared for the consequences. Because once you make accusations like that, there's no taking them back. I nodded, feeling the weight of confirmation from someone whose judgment I trusted completely. Maria had spent 15 years advocating for kids who had no other advocates, fighting for resources and support systems in a world that often treated foster youth as disposable. If she believed that exposing corruption was worth the personal cost, then maybe my instincts were right. Hypothetically, I said, what would be the best way to make sure the right people see evidence like that? Maria considered the question. Municipal corruption usually falls under federal jurisdiction, especially if it involves wire fraud or interstate commerce. The FBI has a public corruption unit that handles cases like that. But you'd want to make sure you have legal representation before you approach federal authorities. What kind of legal representation? Someone who specializes in whistleblower cases, she said. Someone who understands both the protection available to people who report corruption and the potential retaliation they might face. I left Maria's office with a clear sense of direction and a recommendation for an attorney who'd handled several high-profile corruption cases in Oregon. But I also left with a deeper understanding of what I was contemplating. This wasn't just about exposing Dad's crimes. This was about becoming a federal whistleblower against a powerful man with powerful friends, in a city where business and politics and social connections were all intertwined. The attorney Maria had recommended was named Philip Carver, and his office was in one of Portland's older downtown buildings, the kind with marble lobbies and brass elevators that spoke of established respectability. I'd called ahead and scheduled a consultation for that afternoon, describing the situation in vague terms that wouldn't commit me to anything, but would give him enough information to prepare for our conversation. Carver's office reflected his reputation, understated but expensive, filled with law books and framed diplomas and photographs with politicians and business leaders. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of confident bearing that came from winning cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch. Ms. Hartwell, he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip that suggested he'd already researched my family background. I understand you have some concerns about potential municipal corruption. I have evidence of systematic kickbacks and fraudulent billing in city construction projects, I said, deciding that directness was the only approach that made sense. The person involved is my father. Carver's expression didn't change, but I caught a slight shift in his posture that suggested he was reassessing both the case and my motivations for bringing it to him. Before we go any further, he said, I need to understand your goals in this situation. Are you looking for advice on how to handle evidence you've discovered, or are you looking for representation in bringing forward allegations against your father? I don't know yet, I admitted. I found documentation that proves my father has been taking bribes from subcontractors in exchange for favorable treatment on municipal projects. The evidence spans almost a decade and involves millions of dollars in public funds. And you're considering whether to report this to federal authorities? I'm considering whether I have an obligation to report it, I said, and whether there's any way to do it that doesn't destroy my entire family in the process. Carver leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of analytical gaze that probably served him well in courtrooms. Can you tell me how you obtained this evidence? I explained about finding the financial documents in my belongings, about the cabin office, about the pattern of deposits that corresponded with contract awards. As I talked, Carver took notes in a leather portfolio, occasionally asking questions about dates and amounts and the nature of the documentation. The evidence you're describing would likely be sufficient for federal prosecution, he said when I finished. Wire fraud, conspiracy, possibly RICO charges depending on how extensive the corruption was. Your father could be looking at decades in prison. And my family? Anyone who knowingly benefited from the proceeds of criminal activity could face civil forfeiture, he said bluntly. The family home, investment accounts, retirement funds. The government can seize assets that were purchased with money obtained through criminal activity. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Even if they didn't know about the corruption? The law doesn't require knowledge of criminal activity for asset forfeiture, Carver explained. It only requires that the assets were purchased with proceeds from criminal activity. Your mother's jewelry, your brother's education, the family vacation home. All of it could be subject to seizure if it can be shown that it was purchased with money your father obtained illegally. The reality hit me like a physical blow. Exposing Dad's corruption wouldn't just send him to prison. It would financially destroy everyone who'd ever benefited from his criminal activity, including Mom and Ryan and Jessica and their unborn child. Is there any way to report the corruption without involving federal asset forfeiture? I asked. Not if you want the charges to stick, Carver said. Federal prosecutors use asset forfeiture as both a punishment and a deterrent. It sends a message that crime doesn't pay, literally. We spent another hour discussing the mechanics of federal whistleblower cases, the protections available to people who report corruption, and the likelihood of retaliation from powerful people who might be implicated in Dad's criminal network. By the time I left Carver's office, I had a clear understanding of what would happen if I moved forward with reporting Dad's crimes. I also had his business card and a retainer agreement that would formalize our attorney-client relationship if I decided to proceed. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the evidence I'd compiled, trying to imagine the conversation where I would tell Mom that her comfortable retirement was built on stolen money, where I would explain to Ryan that his career and reputation would be destroyed by his father's crimes, where I would watch Jessica realize that her child would grow up with a family name associated with federal corruption charges. But I also tried to imagine the conversation where I would tell Keisha and my other kids that I'd discovered evidence of millions of dollars being stolen from public programs, but had chosen to protect my family's financial interests instead of fighting for justice. Both conversations were unbearable, but only one of them would let me sleep at night. I opened my laptop and began typing a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered, organizing the evidence in a way that would be clear to federal investigators. I wasn't ready to make the call to the FBI yet, but I was ready to prepare for that possibility. Because David Hartwell had been right about one thing at the retirement party. I was different from the rest of my family. I was the kind of person who would choose justice over comfort, truth over convenience, principle over privilege. He'd called it being a mistake. I was starting to think it was exactly who I was supposed to be. The call to the FBI field office in Portland came on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Dad's retirement party. I'd rehearsed what I would say dozens of times, but my voice still shook as I explained to the receptionist that I had information about municipal corruption involving public works contracts. I'd like to speak with someone from the public corruption unit, I said, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Can I ask the nature of the information you'd like to report? The receptionist asked, her tone professional, but curious. Systematic bribery and kickback schemes involving Portland City construction projects, I replied, spanning approximately 10 years and involving millions in public funds. There was a pause. Please hold while I transfer you to Special Agent Rodriguez. Agent Carmen Rodriguez had a voice that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of corruption allegations and wasn't easily impressed. But as I outlined what I'd discovered about Dad's financial records and the corresponding municipal contracts, I could hear her attention sharpen. Ms. Hartwell, she said when I finished my summary, these are serious allegations. Before we proceed, I need to confirm that you understand the implications of filing a formal complaint with federal authorities. I understand, I said, though my stomach was churning with the reality of what I was setting in motion. Are you represented by counsel? Yes. Philip Carver is my attorney. Good. We'll need to schedule a formal interview where you can present your evidence. Mr. Carver should be present for that meeting. Are you available Friday afternoon? Friday. 2 days to prepare for the conversation that would irreversibly change my family's life. 2 days to second-guess myself and consider backing out. 2 days to live with the knowledge that I was about to destroy the people who'd raised me, even if they'd never fully accepted me. I called Philip immediately after hanging up with Agent Rodriguez. He'd been expecting my call since our consultation, and his first question cut straight to the heart of my lingering doubts. Are you certain about this, Claire? Once we walk into that FBI office, there's no controlling what happens next. I'm certain, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. Thursday night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phone call I should make to Ryan, warning him about what was coming. The call to Mom, giving her a chance to prepare for the media attention and social devastation that would follow federal charges against Dad. The call to Jessica, apologizing for the fact that her child would inherit a legacy of criminal prosecution instead of engineering excellence. But each time I reached for my phone, I thought about the kids in foster care who'd been denied services because public money had been diverted into Dad's private accounts. I thought about Keisha and the dozens of other young people who'd struggled to find stable housing and job training, while my father was stealing millions from programs designed to help them. The FBI field office occupied several floors of a nondescript government building downtown, all security checkpoints and fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional carpet that had probably been ugly when it was installed 20 years ago. Philip met me in the lobby, carrying a briefcase that contained copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. "Remember," he said as we waited for Agent Rodriguez, "answer their questions directly and completely, but don't volunteer information they haven't asked for. Let them guide the conversation." Agent Rodriguez turned out to be a compact woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent years investigating people who thought they were too smart to get caught. She led us to a conference room that smelled like industrial coffee and stale air conditioning. "Ms. Hartwell," she began, "before we review your evidence, I want to make sure you understand what typically happens in cases like this. If we determine that your allegations are credible, we'll open a formal investigation. That investigation will likely involve surveillance, financial audits, and interviews with anyone who might have knowledge of the alleged criminal activity." "Including my family members?" I asked. "Including anyone who might have information relevant to the case," she confirmed. "Your father will almost certainly become aware that he's under federal investigation long before any charges are filed. Are you prepared for the impact that will have on your personal relationships?" I thought about the retirement party, about being called the biggest mistake of Dad's career, about 30 years of being treated like a failed experiment in parenting. "My personal relationships with my family ended 3 weeks ago," I said. "This is about justice for the people who were harmed by my father's crimes." Rodriguez nodded and opened a digital recorder. "Let's begin with how you first became aware of potentially criminal activity." For the next 3 hours, I walked through everything I'd discovered. The financial documents that showed deposits corresponding with contract awards, the correspondence that proved Dad had been taking bribes in exchange for favorable treatment of subcontractors, the systematic nature of the corruption that had been ongoing for nearly a decade. Philip had organized the evidence meticulously, and Rodriguez examined each document with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. She asked detailed questions about dates and amounts, about how I'd obtained the documentation, about my knowledge of Dad's business relationships and Pacific Engineering's contracting procedures. "This is substantial evidence of federal crimes," she said when we'd finished reviewing everything. "Wire fraud, conspiracy, potentially RICO violations if we can establish an ongoing criminal enterprise. I'll need to discuss this with my supervisor, but I anticipate we'll be opening a formal investigation within the week." "What happens next?" Philip asked. "We'll begin with financial analysis to trace the flow of funds and identify all parties involved in the alleged scheme," Rodriguez explained. "We'll also start interviewing potential witnesses and gathering additional documentation from city records and Pacific Engineering's files." "How long before my father knows he's under investigation?" I asked. "That depends on how careful he's been about covering his tracks," Rodriguez said. "But in my experience, people who've been committing crimes for this long usually get sloppy about operational security. I'd estimate he'll know within a month that federal agents are asking questions about his business practices." I left the FBI building feeling like I'd crossed a bridge that had burned behind me. There was no going back now, no way to pretend I hadn't discovered Dad's crimes or chosen to report them to federal authorities. The investigation would proceed whether I changed my mind or not. Philip walked me to my car, his expression thoughtful. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" he asked. "You mean the part where my family disowns me completely, instead of just mostly?" I replied. "I mean the part where your father and his associates try to discredit you," Philip said seriously. "Criminal defendants don't go quietly, especially when they have resources and connections. David will hire the best defense attorneys money can buy, and they'll do everything they can to portray you as a vindictive daughter making false accusations." "Let them try," I said. "The evidence speaks for itself." But as I drove home through Portland's afternoon traffic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just declared war against people who had more weapons than I did. The first sign that the investigation was moving quickly came the following Tuesday. I was at work, helping a 17-year-old named Marcus navigate the paperwork for transitional housing, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Agent Rodriguez. Can you call me when you have a private moment?" I stepped into Maria's office and closed the door before dialing the number Rodriguez had given me. "Claire," she said when she answered, "I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've been reviewing Pacific Engineering's financial records, and we found evidence that corroborates everything you reported. The pattern of payments you identified is even more extensive than your documentation showed." "What does that mean?" "It means your father wasn't just taking kickbacks from subcontractors," Rodriguez said. "He was systematically inflating project budgets and skimming the difference. The total amount of theft appears to be significantly higher than the evidence you provided suggested." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How much higher?" "Conservative estimate, $15 to $20 million over the past decade." The number hit like a physical blow. I'd known Dad's corruption was systematic, but the scale of the theft was staggering. $20 million stolen from public works projects, money that should have gone to infrastructure improvements and public services. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "We've identified several other Pacific Engineering employees who appear to have been involved in the scheme. This wasn't just your father acting alone." "Who else?" "I can't give you specific names yet, but the investigation has expanded to include multiple targets. The federal prosecutor's office is considering RICO charges, which carry much more severe penalties than simple fraud." After Rodriguez hung up, I sat in Maria's office trying to process what I'd learned. Dad wasn't just a corrupt engineer taking bribes. He was the ringleader of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically looting Portland's municipal budget for years. But more immediately, I knew that word of the federal investigation would reach Dad soon. Rodriguez had been right about operational security. People who'd been committing crimes for a decade usually got careless about hiding their tracks. The call came that evening, while I was making dinner in my small kitchen. Dad's name appeared on my phone screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. We hadn't spoken since the retirement party, and I couldn't imagine this conversation going well. "Claire," Dad's voice was tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I know what you did," he said. "I know you went to the FBI with your little stories about my business practices." "They're not stories, Dad. They're federal crimes." There was a long pause. "You have no idea what you've done. No idea how many people you're going to hurt with these ridiculous accusations." "I know exactly what I've done," I said. "I reported systematic theft of public funds to the appropriate authorities. The only thing I regret is that it took me this long to find the evidence." "Evidence?" Dad's voice rose sharply. "You stole private documents from my office. You violated my privacy and then twisted what you found to make it look like something it's not." "I found proof that you've been taking bribes and kickbacks for nearly a decade," I said. $20 million stolen from Portland taxpayers while you lectured me about integrity and work ethic." "Those were consulting fees," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perfectly legal business arrangements that you're too naive to understand." "Consulting fees that corresponded exactly with contract awards? Payments that were never reported on your tax returns? Business arrangements that were documented in emails, talking about, quote, mutually beneficial collaborations, and, quote, considerations for future opportunities?" Dad was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming something harder and more dangerous than I'd ever heard from him. "You think you're so righteous," he said, "so morally superior to the rest of us, but you have no idea what it takes to build something real in this world. No idea what it costs to provide for a family, to create opportunities, to make sure your children have better lives than you did." "I know what it costs to help kids who don't have families to provide for them," I replied. "Kids who could have been helped with the money you stole from public programs." "You self-righteous little bitch," Dad snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "You couldn't stand that Ryan succeeded where you failed, so you decided to destroy everything we built. Well, congratulations. You've just guaranteed that your brother's career is over, that your mother will be humiliated in front of everyone she knows, that Jessica's child will grow up with a grandfather in federal prison. You guaranteed all of that when you decided to become a criminal, I said. I just decided to stop pretending I didn't know about it. This family is finished, Dad said, his voice cold with finality. You'll never be welcome in any of our lives again. And when the truth comes out about what kind of person you really are, when everyone sees how you betrayed your own family for your twisted sense of justice, you'll understand what it really means to be alone. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the echo of his final words ringing in my head. But instead of the devastation he'd intended, I felt something else entirely. Relief. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to pretend that David Hartwell was a good man, who deserved my respect and loyalty. For the first time in my life, I was free to see him exactly as he was. A criminal who'd spent decades stealing from the public while building a reputation based on lies. The next morning brought vindication in the form of a headline in the Oregonian. Federal investigation targets Portland engineering firm in municipal corruption probe. The article was brief, noting that Pacific Engineering Solutions and several of its employees were under investigation for alleged fraud in connection with city construction contracts, but it was enough to confirm that the FBI's work was proceeding rapidly. My phone started ringing before I'd finished reading the article. Reporters wanting comments about my father's alleged crimes. Colleagues from Portland Youth Services expressing shock and support. Distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly interested in family drama. I turned off my phone and went to work, where Maria had already fielded several calls from journalists trying to get information about my involvement in the investigation. "How are you holding up?" she asked when I arrived at the office. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel guilty about destroying my family. Instead, I feel like I finally did something that mattered." "You did," Maria said firmly. "Those were public funds that should have gone to programs like ours. Every dollar your father stole was a dollar that didn't help kids who needed it." That afternoon, while I was reviewing case files for upcoming court hearings, Philip called with news that made everything feel surreal and inevitable at once. "The federal prosecutor's office just announced that they're filing charges against your father and 3 other Pacific Engineering employees," he said. 17 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of conspiracy, and 5 RICO violations. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning. When will he be arrested? "Probably tonight or early tomorrow morning," Philip said. Federal agents don't usually wait long between filing charges and making arrests, especially in high-profile cases like this. I hung up and sat at my desk, surrounded by files about kids who needed stable housing and job training and educational support, thinking about the fact that my father would spend tomorrow night in federal custody instead of his comfortable suburban home. Justice, I realized, felt nothing like I'd expected it to. It wasn't satisfying or triumphant or emotionally cathartic. It just felt necessary, like finally taking medicine for an infection that had been poisoning your system for years. That evening, I drove past my parents' house for the first time since the retirement party. The lights were on, and I could see figures moving behind the curtains, probably family members gathering to prepare for the media storm that would follow Dad's arrest. I didn't stop. I had nothing to say to them that wouldn't make the situation worse, and they had nothing to say to me that I needed to hear. Instead, I went home to my small apartment and waited for tomorrow's news coverage, knowing that by this time next week, everyone in Portland would know exactly what kind of man David Hartwell really was. The mistake he'd called me had finally accomplished something worth accomplishing. The arrest happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, captured by news cameras that had been stationed outside my parents' house since dawn. I watched the footage later on the local news. Dad being led away in handcuffs, his lawyer walking beside him with the practiced calm of someone who'd handled federal criminal cases before. Mom standing in the doorway in her bathrobe looking like her world had just collapsed. Because it had. The federal indictment made the front page of every newspaper in Oregon and led the evening news across the Pacific Northwest. 17 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, 5 RICO violations, and 1 count of money laundering. The language was clinical and precise, but it told the story of a man who'd systematically stolen over $22 million from Portland taxpayers over the course of 9 years. I read every article, watched every news broadcast, absorbed every detail of the case I'd set in motion. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, email communications, testimony from subcontractors who'd been paying bribes in exchange for favorable treatment. Dad's defense team would try to fight the charges, but everyone involved knew this was about negotiating a plea deal rather than proving innocence. 3 other Pacific Engineering employees were arrested the same morning, including Tom Morrison, the senior project manager who'd worked directly under Dad for 15 years. The ripple effects spread through Portland's business community like wildfire. Pacific Engineering's stock price collapsed. Municipal contracts were suspended pending investigation. The mayor held a press conference promising a complete audit of all city construction projects dating back to 2010. But it was the human cost that hit hardest, even though I'd known it was coming. Ryan called me the day after Dad's arrest. His voice was hollow, drained of the confidence that had always defined him. "I hope you're satisfied," he said without preamble. "I hope destroying our family was worth whatever moral victory you think you've won." "This isn't about moral victory," I replied. "It's about $22 million stolen from public programs." "It's about revenge," Ryan shot back. "You couldn't stand that Dad was successful while you were struggling, so you decided to tear down everything he built." "Everything he built was paid for with stolen money," I said. "Your Stanford education, Jessica's engagement ring, the house you grew up in, all of it bought with funds that were supposed to go to public works projects." "You don't know that," Ryan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The federal prosecutors know it. That's why they're seizing all of Dad's assets, including the trust fund that was supposed to pay for your kids' college education." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Pacific Engineering terminated my employment yesterday," Ryan said finally. 24 hours notice. No severance, no recommendations, no acknowledgement of 8 years of work. My association with Dad made me radioactive. I felt a stab of guilt, quickly followed by anger at myself for feeling guilty. Ryan's career problems weren't my fault. They were the consequence of Dad's criminal activity, the inevitable result of building a professional reputation on connections to someone who turned out to be a federal criminal. "I'm sorry about your job," I said, and meant it. "No, you're not," Ryan replied. "You're sorry that you feel bad about it. But you're not sorry it happened. This is what you wanted. Dad discredited, our family destroyed, me and Jessica and the baby paying the price for your need to prove how righteous you are. What I wanted was for Dad to stop stealing from programs that help kids in foster care," I said. "What I wanted was for someone to be held accountable for $22 million in theft from public funds. And what you got was a family that will never speak to you again," Ryan said. "I hope it was worth it." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me with the echo of words that stung more than I'd expected. Not because I regretted reporting Dad's crimes, but because I realized that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. The next call came from Jessica, and it was worse. "Claire," she said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and stress. "I'm at the hospital. I started bleeding this morning, and the doctors are worried about the baby." My heart clenched. "Is there anything I can do?" "You can turn back time and not destroy our lives," Jessica said bitterly. "The stress from Dad's arrest, from Ryan losing his job, from having federal agents ask questions about every dollar we've ever spent, it's all too much. The doctor says stress can cause complications in pregnancy." "Jessica, I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't help," she cut me off. "Sorry doesn't pay our mortgage now that Ryan's unemployed. Sorry doesn't make the reporters stop calling. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that our child is going to grow up with a grandfather in federal prison because his aunt decided to play whistleblower." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "The baby's complications aren't my fault," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Aren't they?" Jessica asked. You knew what would happen to all of us if you went to the FBI. You knew Ryan would lose his job, that Mom would be humiliated, that our family would be destroyed. But you did it anyway, because your principles mattered more than our lives. Dad's crimes would have been discovered eventually, I said. Federal investigators don't ignore $22 million in missing public funds. Maybe, Jessica said, but they discovered them because you gave them the evidence. They arrested Dad because you provided the documentation. Our family fell apart because you chose to make it fall apart. After she hung up, I sat in my apartment wondering if she was right. Had my decision to report Dad's crimes been about justice, or had it been about revenge disguised as moral principle? Was there a difference? And did it matter if the end result was the same? The answer came 3 days later, in the form of a phone call from Carmen Rodriguez. Claire, the FBI agent said, I wanted to update you on something we discovered during our investigation. Your father's corruption was more extensive than even our initial charges indicated. What do you mean? We found evidence that Pacific Engineering was systematically overcharging the city for materials and labor, then splitting the excess payments with subcontractors who were in on the scheme, Rodriguez explained. The total amount of theft appears to be closer to $35 million, and it involved at least 12 different companies over the past decade. The number was staggering. $35 million stolen from Portland taxpayers. Money that should have gone to schools and housing programs and infrastructure improvements. There's more, Rodriguez continued. We've identified irregularities in contracts dating back to 2005, which suggests your father's criminal activity began much earlier than we initially thought. We're talking about potentially 15 years of systematic corruption. 15 years, I repeated, trying to process the scope of Dad's crimes. The federal prosecutor's office is considering additional charges, including tax evasion and racketeering. Your father is looking at a potential sentence of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. After Rodriguez hung up, I sat with the weight of what I'd learned. Dad hadn't just been a corrupt engineer taking occasional bribes. He'd been the architect of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically looting Portland's municipal budget for over a decade. The scale of the theft was breathtaking, and the impact on public services was incalculable. I thought about the kids I worked with at Portland Youth Services, teenagers aging out of foster care who struggled to find stable housing and job training because funding for social programs was always inadequate. I thought about the schools that operated with outdated textbooks and overcrowded classrooms because education budgets were stretched too thin. I thought about the infrastructure projects that had been delayed or canceled because the city couldn't afford to maintain basic services. All of it while David Hartwell was stealing millions of dollars to fund his family's comfortable lifestyle and his son's Ivy League education. The guilt I'd been feeling about Ryan and Jessica's problems evaporated, replaced by something harder and clearer. This wasn't about family loyalty or personal revenge. This was about justice for an entire community that had been systematically robbed by people they'd trusted to manage public resources responsibly. Mom's call came 2 weeks after Dad's arrest, and it was the conversation I'd been dreading since I'd first decided to contact the FBI. Claire. Her voice was tired in a way I'd never heard before. I need you to know that your father is talking about taking a plea deal. What kind of plea deal? 20 years in federal prison in exchange for full restitution and cooperation with the investigation into other contractors who were involved in the scheme, Mom said. His lawyers say it's the best option given the evidence against him. Mom, I'm not calling to argue with you, she interrupted. I'm calling to tell you that I understand why you did what you did. The words hit me like a thunderbolt. What? I found things, Mom said quietly. Papers that David thought he'd hidden. Account statements for investments I didn't know existed. Records of payments that were never reported on our tax returns. I've been living in a house paid for with stolen money, wearing jewelry bought with funds that belonged to the public. She paused, and I could hear her crying softly. I don't know how long I suspected something wasn't right about our finances. Part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to ask questions that might have uncomfortable answers. But you forced me to see the truth about what my life has been built on. Mom, I never wanted to hurt you. I know, she said. And I know that what you did was right, even though it's destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my family. The house is being seized by federal marshals next week. The investment accounts have been frozen. I'm moving in with my sister in Seattle until I can figure out how to rebuild my life at 63 years old. The image of Mom, who'd spent 40 years building a social reputation in Portland's charitable community, having to start over with nothing in a different city was almost unbearable. Is there anything I can do to help? I asked. You've done enough, Mom said, but her tone wasn't angry. You did what needed to be done, even knowing it would cost you your family. I'm not sure I could have made that choice. I'm not sure I made a choice, I admitted. I'm not sure I could have lived with myself if I'd stayed silent about what I found. That's what makes you different from the rest of us, Mom said. That's what makes you stronger. After she hung up, I cried for the first time since Dad's retirement party. Not from guilt or regret, but from grief for the family that might have been, if David Hartwell had chosen integrity over greed, if he'd built his success on merit rather than corruption, if he'd been the man I'd believed him to be when I was young enough to think he was a hero. The federal sentencing hearing took place on a gray November morning, 8 months after Dad's arrest. I sat in the back of the courtroom with Philip, watching as the man who'd called me his biggest mistake stood before a federal judge to hear his fate. Dad had aged dramatically in the months since his arrest. His hair had gone completely white, and he'd lost weight in a way that made his expensive suit hang loose on his frame. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of facing consequences for actions he'd probably convinced himself were just clever business practices. The federal prosecutor outlined the scope of Dad's crimes with clinical precision. $38 million in theft from public funds over 15 years, systematic corruption that had inflated construction costs and reduced the quality of public infrastructure, a criminal enterprise that had involved dozens of contractors and subcontractors in a web of fraud that had cheated Portland taxpayers out of resources that should have gone to schools, housing programs, and essential city services. The defendant's crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of public trust, the prosecutor said. Mr. Hartwell was in a position to ensure that taxpayer dollars were used efficiently and honestly for the benefit of the community. Instead, he systematically stole those funds to enrich himself and his co-conspirators. Dad's defense attorney tried to portray his client as a man who'd made poor judgment calls rather than a calculating criminal, emphasizing his charitable contributions and community involvement. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern of corruption too clear and deliberate. When the judge asked Dad if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood slowly and looked around the courtroom. His eyes found me in the back row, and for a moment, we stared at each other across the space that had opened between us. Your Honor, Dad said, his voice barely audible, I take full responsibility for my actions. I have no excuse for what I did, and I understand that my crimes have harmed not just the taxpayers of Portland, but my own family as well. He paused, still looking at me. I especially want to apologize to my daughter Claire, who had the courage to do what was right even when it cost her everything she had. She is not the mistake I called her. The mistake was mine, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it. The judge sentenced David Hartwell to 22 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years, full restitution to the city of Portland, forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity, a lifetime ban on working in any capacity involving public contracts or municipal projects. Dad was 75 years old. Even with parole, he would likely die in federal prison. I walked out of the courthouse into the pale November sunlight, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a quiet sense of completion. The man who'd systematically stolen from public programs while building a reputation based on integrity and community service was finally being held accountable for his crimes. But more than that, I'd finally answered the question that had haunted me since the retirement party. What kind of person was I willing to be? The answer was someone who chose justice over comfort, truth over family loyalty, principle over personal cost. Someone who believed that some things mattered more than maintaining relationships with people who'd never really accepted her anyway. A year later, I stood in front of a very different kind of audience. The Portland City Council chamber was packed with teenagers from foster care, social workers, community advocates, and city officials gathered for the announcement of the David Hartwell Accountability Fund. $38 million in recovered assets would be used to create comprehensive support services for youth aging out of foster care, including housing assistance, job training, educational support, and mental health services. This fund represents something more than recovered stolen money, I said into the microphone, looking out at faces that included Keisha and Marcus and dozens of other young people I'd worked with over the years. It represents the principle that public resources belong to the public, especially to those who need them most. Maria sat in the front row, beaming with pride at the program we'd spent months designing. The fund would triple our capacity to help kids transition from foster care to independent living, providing the kind of comprehensive support that could change the trajectory of hundreds of lives. The young people in this room have faced challenges that most of us can't imagine, I continued. They've survived family dysfunction, system failures, and societal neglect. But they've also demonstrated resilience, determination, and hope that inspire everyone who works with them. I looked out at the audience, at teenagers who'd been written off by families and systems and society, who'd been told they were mistakes or burdens or lost causes. "You are not mistakes," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "You are not disposable. You matter. Your futures matter. And this community has an obligation to support you as you build lives worth living." The applause was thunderous, but what mattered more were the faces looking back at me. Kids who'd finally heard someone in authority say that they deserved investment, that their potential was worth developing, that their success mattered to people beyond themselves. After the ceremony, I drove home through Portland neighborhoods I'd come to know in a different way over the past year. Not as the disappointing daughter of a successful engineer, but as someone who'd helped expose corruption that had harmed an entire community, and then worked to transform the consequences into something positive. My apartment was still small, my salary was still modest, and my family relationships were still fractured beyond repair. Ryan and Jessica had moved to Denver, where Ryan had found work with an engineering firm that didn't care about his family connections. Mom was rebuilding her life in Seattle, volunteering with senior services, and slowly constructing a new identity that didn't depend on her husband's reputation. We exchanged Christmas cards now, brief notes that acknowledged shared history without attempting to rebuild relationships that had been built on false foundations. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acceptance that we'd all made choices that had led us to different places. Dad wrote me a letter from federal prison 6 months after his sentencing. It was 2 pages of handwriting on institutional stationery, filled with apologies and regrets and acknowledgments of harm he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, just expressed gratitude that someone in his family had possessed the integrity he'd lacked. I read the letter once and filed it away, not out of anger but because the relationship it attempted to rebuild had never really existed. The father I'd loved as a child had been a fiction, a carefully constructed image that had hidden a man who was willing to steal from the community he'd claimed to serve. The real David Hartwell was the one who'd called me a mistake at his retirement party, who'd systematically excluded me from family planning, who'd built his success on criminal activity while lecturing others about integrity and work ethic. But his assessment of me had been wrong in ways he'd never understand. I wasn't his mistake. I was his antithesis. I was the part of his legacy that had chosen truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty, principle over personal cost. I was the daughter who'd proven that the Hartwell name could be associated with something other than corruption and greed. 3 years after Dad's sentencing, I received a promotion to Director of Portland Youth Services, with a mandate to expand our programs using the ongoing disbursements from the Accountability Fund. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that had nothing to do with salary or prestige, focused on helping young people who'd been failed by systems and families build futures that seemed impossible when they'd started. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about the path that had led me from that retirement party to this life, the humiliation that had forced me to examine my family's foundations more carefully, the evidence that had revealed systematic corruption spanning decades, the choice between family loyalty and community justice that had seemed impossible until it became inevitable. I'd lost the family I'd grown up with, but I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I was capable of doing the right thing, even when it cost everything I'd thought I wanted. The kids I worked with understood that better than most adults. They'd survived families that had failed them, systems that had abandoned them, communities that had written them off as problems to be managed rather than people with potential to be developed. But they'd also learned that survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about choosing who you wanted to become, despite where you'd come from. That's what I'd learned from David Hartwell's retirement party, from the investigation that followed, from the family relationships that hadn't survived the truth about how our comfortable life had been funded. Some mistakes are worth making. Some bridges are worth burning. Some principles are worth defending even when the cost seems unbearable. And sometimes, the biggest mistake someone can make is calling their daughter a mistake, especially when that daughter has the courage and integrity they'd spent a lifetime pretending to possess. The fund would continue dispersing recovered assets for years to come, supporting young people who'd been discarded by families and systems, but who possessed the resilience to build meaningful lives with adequate support. Every dollar that went to housing assistance or job training or educational support was a dollar that had been stolen from the community and returned to its rightful purpose. David Hartwell had called me his biggest mistake, but history would remember me as the person who'd ensured that his real mistakes, the theft, the corruption, the betrayal of public trust, were exposed and corrected. That was a legacy I could live with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.